of the UN Food and Agriculture, the FAO at the UN of the economics, the development economics division from 2002 to 2007. He has led everywhere he's been throughout his career. He's been a director and a leader. He worked with CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, for 15 years, from 1987 to 2002, first with IRRI in the Philippines and then with CIMMYT in Mexico. Professor Pingali is a member of the US National Academy of Sciences and of the he's a fellow of the American Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. He has written at least 13 books and over 120 refereed journal articles and book chapters about food policy, agriculture, and many other things. Just to give you a sense, in the last few years, not only was he an editor of the Handbook of Agricultural Economics, but he has written or edited books such as Agriculture and Rural Development in a Globalizing World, Agriculture and Food Systems to 2050, Global Trends, Challenges and Opportunities, and many others. So thank you very much, Prabhu, for joining us and giving your talk here, and we are so welcome to have you, even if virtually.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for the great introduction. Thank you, Anil and Deborah, for also inviting me to be part of the CAFE seminar series. It's a great pleasure to talk to you all. I wish I could do that in person like I did last time, but maybe we'll have another occasion to do that in the future. What I want to do today is talk to you about food systems. You know, food systems is in the vogue, and everyone's talking about food systems today. People interested in environmental issues, climate issues, health issues. Everyone's focused on food systems as the cause of the problems that they're facing, but also potentially as a solution to some of the problems that we are facing globally. And there's been a recent food system summit that took place to see how food systems can be transformed and make food systems much more compatible with addressing some of the global challenges that we face. In all of this discussion of food systems, it's very easy to forget that food systems have been transforming pretty much continuously over a long period of time, and that food system transformation is not something new. And when I think about food systems, I think about food systems in terms of 4 distinct transformations that took place since about the 1960s. And these transformations have been driven by demographic factors, economic factors, policy factors, and also overall consumer taste, consumer behavior, etc. And it's really important for us to understand how food systems have evolved, how food systems have transformed themselves as we think about trying to figure out future food systems, as we think about how do we create new transformation in food systems that creates this nexus of food, environment, and health that tries to support each other and tries to complement each other rather than be in conflict with each other. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. So let me start at the beginning of this generation that we've been through, which in my view starts around 1960. And let's think back to 1960. 1960 was a period when the global community was facing massive food deficits. The global community was facing massive starvations, particularly in Asia. There were serious discussions going on about triage, about the fact that Asia would never be able to feed itself, and we'd have to figure out a way to protect the rest of the world while Asia continued to starve. These were serious discussions going on. And that then led to a global attention and a global effort towards addressing the problem of hunger, addressing the problem of starvation in Asia and across the developing world. And that led to the Green Revolution happening. And we know many of us know the story about the Green Revolution. But I think one slide tells us the enormous success of the Green Revolution, and one that's not adequately celebrated. And that is that because of the enormous amounts of investments that we've made in agriculture, research, and technology, especially in addressing staple crop productivity, we as a global community have made famine history. We've not seen famines of the type that we've seen in the 40s, 50s, and 60s since the Green Revolution. There's been an exponential decline in famines, and they've completely disappeared in Asia. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't hunger around the world, and this doesn't mean there isn't hunger in Asia, but it's not because of lack of adequate amounts of food. It's because of access issues, equity issues, distributional issues, etc. But the supply side problem around hunger has been a problem that the global community and governments across the developing world, with a particular exception of sub-Saharan Africa, have been able to successfully address over the last few decades. And the data on that is very clear. When you look at what's been happening to productivity trends, yield trends, you see that for most developing country regions, we've seen overall staple grain yields rise from a ton and a half per hectare in the 1960s, going up to 4.5 tons in East Asia, around 3 tons in Latin America, and getting up to 3 tons even for South Asia. So that's been a tremendous change. And here we're talking about national average yields, which pool across agroclimatic zones, ecological zones, etc. So that's been a tremendous change that's happened. Sub-Saharan Africa has continued to be relatively stagnant, but since about the year 2000, there's been a distinct movement upwards of productivity in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm one of the people who believes that there's a renaissance happening in Sub-Saharan African agriculture, and that's something I can come back and talk about in the discussion session. Of course, we know a lot about the unintended consequences of the Green Revolution. We know a lot about the issues around soil fertility, declines. We know about excessive chemical use, excessive water use, etc. But it's also important to recognize that there have been several corrective management practices, corrective technologies that have come up over time in order to reduce or mitigate some of these consequences. But I think one area where we haven't been as successful is in the area of the sort of breadth of the food system. If you look at the set of graphs up here, what I present is the change that we see in overall production of staple grains such as rice, which if you look at India has risen steadily since about 1960s. But look at what happened to some of the more traditional coarse cereals, such as millets, sorghum, pulses, etc. And you see a dramatic drop in these coarse cereals. So while trying to address the problem of hunger, we have sort of inadvertently narrowed the food system down to a few major staples and neglected some of the core cereals and pulses, which are really important for the diets of the poor, which are grown in environments which are not as favorable, and which today are seen as climate resilient crops and seen as the new health foods. So there's been that change that's happened. And it's happened not just in India. You see similar situations in China, Thailand, Bangladesh, and across the Asian continent. So that's been one of the big changes, I think, that one of the unintended consequences that came about from the focus on the big three staple grains, rice, wheat, and maize, as we looked at the transformations of the food system. But what the investments in staple crop productivity did was that the investments were particularly focused on smallholder agriculture systems. And that then led to significant income growth for small farms and smallholders. And that then triggered overall economic growth and structural transformation that we've seen happen across Asia. And many Asian economies, China, Indonesia, Thailand, etc., which were considered extremely low-income, poor economies in the 1960s, became emerging economies with rising middle-class populations by the 1980s, and then became major global powers as we look forward. And that change that we've seen in growth in income, in urbanization, in the rise in non-farm opportunities, etc., also resulted in significant changes in diets. So we saw this diets which were staple grain centric diets becoming much more diversified in terms of increased consumption of fruits, vegetables, dairy products, meat, etc. And also diets which move from carbohydrate-centric diets to also higher sugar, higher fat content diets. So you began to see both a positive in terms of better nutrition, but also in terms of diets which may not be as nutritious and may have had longer term health issues coming in. And both effects were there as we saw this rise in income, rise in middle class populations, and the changes in diets that resulted from it. Those changes happened across Asia, but the magnitude of the changes depended very much on the overall rate of growth in the economies, the overall rate of structural transformation that took place, etc. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that what happened in terms of diet change during this time period was not something unique to Asia. It's a similar changes that have been observed in diets in Europe historically, similar changes that have been observed in the US historically and in other parts of the developed world. So economists talk about Engel's law showing that as incomes rise, the share of expenditure on food declines relative to all other expenditures. It doesn't mean that the overall amount of food that individuals consume becomes smaller, but as their overall income rises, that share of the amount of income spent on food begins to decline. And that's the Engel's curve. And you see that pattern of that declining share of income spent on food replicating itself in Asia as it has in Europe and other parts of the developed world historically. Similarly, economists talk about the Bennett's Law, where as overall incomes rise, the share of income spent on non-starchy food, non-carbohydrate foods like fruits, vegetables, etc., rises relative to starchy food. And again, when you look at data from Asia, you see a very similar pattern to what we've seen in other parts of the world. But I think when you look at food expenditures and when you look at trends across time, one thing becomes very clear in Asia, that even though with income growth, we've seen diversification happening and the demand for food diversity rising, we also see that fat consumption has risen significantly more than the rise in consumption of more nutritious food, such as fresh food, vegetables, fruit, etc. And part of the reason for that is the higher fat content food has been much cheaper to produce and distribute. And the investments needed in providing fresh food into urban markets, into urban consumption centers were not made to the extent that was necessary in order to meet the rising demand for the more perishable, the more nutritious food. So over time, you began to see this imbalance between the demand for higher quality diversity of diets and the lack of adequate supply that matches that demand. And at the same time, a diet that was stripping from high starchy foods towards higher fat, higher energy diets, and then the health consequences that came from that, which I'll talk about in a minute. The next big change, I think, is a change that came through globalization. Globalization, which came about from about 2000 with the advent of the WTO and with the agreement on agriculture and with the integration of food markets around the world, had an enormous impact on diets. It had an enormous impact both in terms of access to diversity of foods, but it also had very big impacts on consumer behavior and consumer taste. And that's something that I think we need to understand better. And there hasn't been as much work in trying to relate globalization and trade integration with diets and food habits. And that's an area that needs a lot more attention. So first of all, on trade integration, one of the things that the WTO did was it made it much more easier to export food around the world. And as a result of that, we see that tropical products are easily available today in the US and in Europe. And so I live in Ithaca, New York, and in February, when it's minus, I don't know what, 20 degrees around here, I can go into my local supermarket and I can get mangoes coming from the tropics, something unheard of even 20 years ago. At the same time, I could go into a rural or a small town in India and go into the local market and I can find apples from Washington State. And quite often the apples from Washington State may be cheaper than the local mangoes, which are also available in the next stall. So that's what globalization and trade integration has done. It's actually increased the diversity of food that's available to consumers around the world. It's increased the diversity of food for developing countries, as well as for consumers in the developed countries. It's also improved the affordability of a more diverse diet across the world, and particularly true across the developing world. And that needs much better documentation, I think, than it's had up to now. The other big change that most of you are familiar with is that because of globalization and because of the WTO agreement, foreign direct investment in food retail became much more common, more easy to establish, etc. And as a result of that, there's been a tremendous growth in modern retail across the developing world. And here's some data showing the growth of modern retail chains in several countries across Asia. And you see Malaysia, India, etc., showing rapid growth. Although I suspect India would have seen even further growth if the Indian government policy allowed for greater expansion of the grocery chain investments than they have. China, of course, has seen some of the most rapid growth in organized retail than any other country in Asia. And organized retail has been crucial for being the primary conduit of supplying the food needs of urban populations and the growing urban populations and middle class populations in developing countries. But one issue is quite clear when you look at what's supplied through the organized retail chains is much of the food that's accessible to organized retail tends to be long shelf life food and tends to be processed foods such as wheat flour, pastas, noodles, etc., rather than fresh food. So even as countries have advanced, gone into emerging economy status, etc., fresh food purchases have still been left to traditional markets, street markets, etc. And grocery chains haven't picked that up as much. It's changing, but it hasn't changed as fast as one would have thought it would have. And part of the reason for that is the investments in fresh food value chains were not made to the same extent as the investments that were made in procuring staple grains from rural areas within these countries. And it's only in the most recent time periods that we've seen increased attention to building these fresh food value chains across these countries. So with the improved access of grocery chains, with increased foreign direct investment, we've also seen increased sales of packaged food, increased sales of processed foods, and a rise in the consumption of processed foods across Asia. And it's not been just middle class populations. You see access to processed foods cutting through to poorer sections of Asia. And it's not been just urban populations, but rural populations have also been increasingly consuming processed foods and packaged foods. Part of the reason for that is the rising opportunity cost of time. And as opportunity costs of time have risen, the need for labor saving in food preparation has driven a large part of the demand for processed food. And remember, when we say processed food, we're not always talking about ultra processed food, and we're not always talking about things like potato chips and Cokes. We're also talking about food that's semi-prepared or reduces the labor intensity of preparation, such as wheat flour or pastas, etc. So that type of processed food, along with ultra processed food, the demand for both has been rising. And I think the broader health effects have come from a combination of both types of processed foods coming into the market. And so that brings me to what happened to health and nutrition transition across Asia over this time. So it's very clear that when the graph on the right actually shows you what's been happening to malnutrition trends. And I should have gone back to earlier time periods to show what happened to the trends, but the data is not as good. But even with the data we've got, it's very clear that we've seen tremendous gains in reduction in malnutrition. We've seen tremendous gains in hunger reduction, in micronutrient malnutrition reduction, also in child stunting across Asia. Certainly much slower in South Asia compared to East Asia and Southeast Asia. And it's certainly important to recognize that we've not completely solved the problem of micronutrient malnutrition. We've not completely solved the problem of child stunting, but we've made tremendous progress in the undernutrition side of the story across the region, where I think we are in major danger zone is the emerging trends that we see in terms of obesity rise and overweight rise that you see across the region. And here you see Malaysia, India, Thailand, etc. All these countries going through a very similar transition. So Asian economies now are facing this challenge of tripping from the traditional focus on undernutrition to increasingly having to deal with the problem of overnutrition and obesity, and consequently the rise in non-communicable diseases. And so the blue shaded areas here show the area, the blue shaded areas here show you, I keep tripping here. The blue shaded areas show the area, the share of non-communicable diseases relative to communicable diseases, which is the pinkish areas. And let's compare 1990 to 2019. Look at the difference over that 30-year time period. And so you've gone from the developing world having, over 2/3 of disease incidents being accounted for in traditional communicable diseases, to switching to 2/3 of the incidents moving towards non-communicable diseases, diabetes, heart disease, etc. And many of these communicable diseases are diseases that are diet related. Diet is not the only reason, but diet is a significant factor in the rise in these diseases. So a major public health challenge across the developing world today is how do you address this dramatic rise that we see in communicable diseases, in non-communicable diseases, and how do you transform food systems in order to address them? So that brings us to the current period that we're in. The current period is since about 2020, I think. I mean, we could be off by a few years, but there's increasing attention to food and food systems today I've been in the food and agriculture business since 1981, 82. And I've not seen as much attention to food and agriculture as I've seen in the last few years. And interestingly, the attention to food and agriculture is coming from outside the community that's traditionally focused on food and agriculture. It's coming from the health community, the nutrition community, the environmental community, the climate community. And they're all looking at food and agriculture and saying, how do we create a nexus of food, environment, climate, human health, and a nexus that complements each other, and food contributes to the global challenges as a solution. And that's where we are, and that's where much of the conversation is going on. But as we talk about this conversation, I think it's also important for us to understand that there's some other trends going on. ICT is leading to some dramatic changes on the supply side of food, both on the production end and trying to see how we can be smarter in food production and contribute to some of the environmental goals. But also, ICT is changing the way in which food is supplied to consumers. And one of the ways you see that is the dramatic rise that we see in e-commerce. E-commerce across Asia has been rising dramatically. And the COVID has some reason for that rise. But I suspect this change is going to be there post-COVID also. And this rise in using e-commerce and e-commerce sort of leapfrogging brick and mortar grocery stores as a means of providing for urban consumers and increasingly consumers in smaller towns, etc. For instance, the second largest grocery chain in India is an e-commerce chain called Flipkart. And it's not a brick and mortar chain, it's completely an e-commerce chain. So those kinds of changes are happening. And we're also seeing this rise in online food delivery. Again, COVID has had something to do with it, but I suspect this will continue beyond COVID, and we'll continue to see this rise in online food delivery directly to consumers' homes. The question that I have is, will e-commerce and will online food delivery lead to better consumer choices in terms of diet diversity, nutritive quality of food, etc., as opposed to the history, which saw consumers being more focused on high energy, high sugar intensive food, and relative to more nutritious food. I think it's an empirical question which we'll have to see over time, but I suspect the answer would depend a lot on the extent to which we build the value chains for bringing fresh food into the food system. To the extent that investments are made to promote fresh food supply into the systems, we may see that also feeding into the e-commerce system. If those investments are not made, then we may not see changes happening in diets because of these innovations in delivery systems. Let me now come to the other parts of the nexus. I could talk more about the environmental nexus, but I don't have enough time, so we can pick that up in the discussions. But let me bring up the climate issues, because I think this has been one of the big drivers of the food systems discussion that's been going on. And part of the reason why climate has been driving the food systems discussion is because of this link between food production, and CO2 emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, methane emissions, etc. And it's this idea that we need to have a food system that's carbon neutral, is an idea that's been driving some of the discussions on the transformation of food systems. So even as we look at increasing productivity in order to meet the needs of a growing population and a richer population, is there a mechanism to do it by reducing the longer term impacts on rising temperatures and longer term effects on greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And that's been driving the discussion, and we'll probably see a lot more of that discussion at the climate summit coming up. So certainly part of the discussion that took place in the food system summit. But I think that's been very much an agenda of the richer countries, the developed countries, and much of the donor communities has been focused on the carbon agenda. But I think for the poor in the developing world, the poor rural communities, the poor farm communities, for them, the issue has been much more about adaptation. How do you adapt to rising temperatures? How do you adapt to the increased incidence of uncertain weather events, droughts, flooding, etc. And how do you create more resilient food systems that are able to cope with climate changes? And I feel that as a global community, we are not giving as much attention to this part of the climate problem as much as we're giving attention to addressing the carbon side of the story. And so we're looking much more at mitigation issues rather than at adaptation issues. And I think that's going to be a challenge, and that's going to be an area where we need a lot more balance if we want to address the needs of the very poor in the developing world, even as we look at long-term issues on mitigating climate change impacts. So let me now come to trying to wrap this all up. So as we think about what's the nexus, and can we get to a better nexus as we look ahead, I think it's important for us to think about convergence. Just think about it. We've got SDG goals. We've got 17 SDG goals. Each of the SDG goals has been sort of built as a silo. And there's been very little attention given to the convergence across SDG goals. There's been very little attention given to the effects of movement on one SDG goal on the other SDG goals. For example, getting to zero hunger. How does getting to zero hunger affect your climate goal, affect your water goal, affect your other environmental goals? Unless we have a convergence across our global goals, we won't be able to think about actions that complement each other and clearly identify the trade-offs and try to minimize those trade-offs. And that's, I think, urgent. And I don't think we are having that discussion with the sense of urgency that we need to. Second, I think we need a lot more policy convergence than we have today. Even today, policies, agendas of the agriculture ministry are separate from the food ministry, the nutrition ministry, the environment ministry, the climate ministry, the trade ministry, etc. And unless you have intersectoral convergence across policies, unless you are able to identify the trade-offs and complementarities across policies, we are never going to be able to create a convergence across these sectors and create a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And that's a major challenge. And it's a political challenge as much as it's an organizational challenge. That brings me to the political economy constraints. And quite often we know what the solutions are, but we're just not able to implement those solutions because of the political backlash to implementing those solutions. And that political economy constraints are as much true in the US and Europe as they are in India and in other developing countries. I think that's an area that needs a lot more work. And it's something that we've shied away from addressing explicitly. We need a diversity of solutions as we look across the developing world, and solutions that fit countries at different stages in the structural transformation process. The Green Revolution was seen as a one solution that fits all situations. And that was possibly not the best way to address some of the countries in the developing world. But looking ahead, I think we know a lot more, and we've got a lot more options for being much more judicious in identifying specific solutions to specific contexts. And finally, I think we need behavior change at all levels. We need behavior change all the way from farmers to consumers to the retail system, to the policy community, to civil society communities, and all levels, in order for us to really understand the connections between food systems, health, environment, climate, and to understand what kinds of behaviors lead to a better future. And I think that's an area where we all need to be thinking about and talking about as we look ahead. I rushed through my discussion and I realize I'm still got a few minutes left for having a Q&A. So let me stop here and thank you all for this opportunity to talk to you. If you want to know more about the work we do at the Tata-Cornell Institute, please visit us on our website, and you can follow us also on our various social media platforms. Thank you very much, and I hand it back to Steve.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. Thank you so much for a stimulating talk. Let's open it up to questions. Deb, are other people able to speak if they're not panelists, or do they need to send in their questions in the chat box?
They can do both. I'm going to allow LTD to talk. That's it.
Okay.
Can I stop share?
You can.
Yeah, you can if you want.
Okay.
And people can raise their hands if they have a question that they would like to ask. Why don't we start with Deb? Well, actually, Norm said he had to leave. Let's start with Norm, and then Deb, and then Anil.
Okay, I can actually spend a little time. My main question is that we saw first. Thank you for very informative seminar. Really appreciated the review of the trends and the costs and benefits, and look to the future in particular. The question that I have is with regards to culture-specific changes, and we saw different sorts of trajectories in different countries, how much of that do you think is due to culture, and how much can culture be changed for the benefit of the system?
That's an important question. I think culture certainly plays a big role in trends, in say livestock consumption trends in a country like India, which because of cultural restrictions, you don't see as much meat consumption as you would see relative to its income levels. And some of that would stick. But I think part of what globalization has done is it's also created a convergence across countries in terms of diets. So among the younger populations, you may see a bigger change happening than in the older population. So over time, you may see much greater convergence, despite the cultural differences. Of course, that's an empirical question.
Deb?
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is about women. They are responsible, they say 60 to 80% of food production in developing countries. I am the daughter of two farmers in Italy. My mom in the 70s, started having babies. I was the third one. And after me, she said, no way, that's it, I'm done. And she had clinics available and she stopped having babies. And from then on, she was able to help in the farm and be active and to create a sustainable farm system. Now, my question is, what policy change and structural transformation has helped or would help the most to economically empower women in agriculture in developing countries? Is giving option for birth control and other practices, is that the case, or doesn't really matter? Or
Oh, it matters a lot. And women's empowerment drives a large part of the nutrition transformation that happens. And some of the work my group has been doing is showing the relationship between women's empowerment and nutrition outcomes, and showing that when women's empowerment is higher, the overall diversity of diets within the households increases and the nutrition outcomes improve significantly. Now, at a macro level, we see that investments in schooling, in literacy, have made a big difference in terms of women's empowerment. Titles to property, titles to land have made a big difference in terms of women's empowerment. And certainly access to birth control. The data across Asia shows a fairly significant drop in fertility rates. And the family sizes have dropped dramatically, not just in China, but across East Asia, across Southeast Asia. And you're beginning to see that drop also in South Asia. So, and that's been happening through not just improved access to family planning, but also increased access to education. And I think those two have worked together very well. The final point here is labor saving technologies. One of the big changes that we've seen over the last few decades is significant improvements in technologies for helping on food processing. So you no longer, even in little villages, you no longer pound your grain to flour. You've got a flour mill right in the village. You've got all types of post-harvest processing technologies that are increasingly available for helping on the labor saving side.
Mhm.
in food preparation and in household activities, etc.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Anil and then Quinn. You're
muted.
You're
Yeah.
muted, Anil. There you go.
Thanks, Prabhu, for a very interesting talk. It sort of really, I love the sweep of the talk over the last 50, 60 years of development in food systems. If you think that the developing countries, and this is what you see from the evidence, are developing countries as a group are, 2 or 3 decades behind the developed world in terms of the shifts that you saw from, staple crops to more higher income elasticity crops and to meats. Many of the changes you showed happening in Asia in the last 20 years happened in Europe and the United States much earlier. But if that's the trend, it's a little easy to be pessimistic about the prospects for positive change in the developing world, because we in the developed world, especially in the United States, we are still sort of struggling with issues of obesity and overnutrition. We don't quite know how to get a handle on these issues. We still have big issues of food deserts, especially fresh produce sort of deserts in low-income neighborhoods in American cities. We yet have to see a shift to more climate resilient crops in the United States, although some of the technological innovations of artificial meats and all that may have some, there might be some sort of opportunity there. So just looking at the failure of the developed countries to sort of address these issues suggests to me that it's going to be a while before we see some of these issues being addressed and meaningfully changed in the developing world. Do you remain as pessimistic as that, or do you think there is opportunity for developing countries to leapfrog and sort of get ahead of the curve here?
I have good days and bad days. I have days when I feel like you do that we're going to go through the same process. But then I also see that there's some changes that you're beginning to see among the educated middle class populations in urban areas across the developing world. You see a lot more demand now for healthier foods than even a few years ago. So foods such as millets and sorghum, etc., are seen as the new foods to consume by middle class consumers. And so there's been a declining per capita consumption of staple grains relative to some of these other foods. So there's that change happening. There's a lot more, at least more discussion about exercise and health among the middle class populations than they used to be in the past. So behavior change is coming in as a way to think about these problems that are emerging and thinking about how do we address them. Where I'm pessimistic is about policy change. We're the traditional support that governments are given to staple grains resulted in the enormous improvements in staple grain productivity. But now reducing that support and moving that from staple grains to other more nutritious foods is become a major challenge. And when farmers who grow staple grains see a reduction in support to them, then that creates political problems, and it creates farmers coming out on the streets and rioting, etc. And that political economy problem could disrupt some of the positive behavioral changes that we are seeing, and could prevent improved access to these more nutritious foods. So that's an issue that worries me. On the positive side, again, I think the food industry is becoming a lot more responsive to identifying newer options for healthier foods, etc. Well, you talked already about plant-based meat, etc. So there are some of those opportunities. So it's going to be a mix, and it'll depend a lot on how governments react to this and how they move forward. Some governments are actually being very proactive on sugary drinks, on soft drinks, and trying to see whether taxing soft drinks, etc., is a way to go forward. So I share some of the pessimism and some of the optimism there.
Thanks, Prabhu.
Prabhu, I have a question for you. About poverty and the poor and access to food by the poor. And you touched on this briefly, and you mentioned how malnutrition and hunger are largely no longer a problem of supply, but of access. And so what are some of the issues you see here in terms of reducing malnutrition and hunger among the poor in the developing world?
So that's a really important question. I don't mean to imply that there's no more hunger or no more poverty, etc. But and speaking specifically from an Indian perspective, I think the Green Revolution led to enormous improvements in poverty reduction in areas which were much more favorable for producing the staples. Punjab, Haryana, Southern India, etc. So in those areas, poverty reduction has been significant and hunger reduction has been significant. But then you look at areas which were not as conducive for the Green Revolution crops, such as Eastern India. You find Eastern India tends to be much higher concentration of poor and food insecure populations. And so for these areas, I think we need to go back to the basics of saying, how do you create an agriculture system that allows these farmers to grow out of poverty? And it's not going to be rice and wheat. What can you do that will change them? And part of the change can come from looking at these so-called orphan crops, the sorghums, millets, etc. And saying, is there an opportunity for reviving those crops in these areas and bringing them into the food system and addressing the rising demand for these crops as the new health foods, the new niche markets, etc. The other is to use these areas to bring in the more perishable foods into the market, etc. So much of the Green Revolution focus was just on staples. Looking beyond them may be one major opportunity. But then safety net programs for the poorest of the poor are absolutely crucial. And one needs to continue to look at how do you create safety nets for these populations that don't have any land, that have very little assets, etc., and then build up their human capital so that they can move out of the agriculture system. It's a complex issue, but that's where we can start.
Thank you. There's a question from Michelle Ortiz. Are you able to unmute?
Yes, hello.
Yes.
I have a question about GMOs in developing countries. I know that sometimes people who are not educated about GMOs can be resistant to them, like with the Golden Rice Project, or even the C4 Rice Project, like how projects with developing plants to be drought resistant or more vitamin rich, they can be beneficial to people and they can be beneficial to the environment. But I was wondering, are there any studies of people in developing countries being hesitant or resistant to these kinds of GMOs? And if so, are there any drive towards education changes, to get more people on board with GMOs in developing countries?
Well, if you look at area under GM crops, right now, developing countries have a larger area under GM crops than the developed countries, total. And that data is reported annually by EASA on their website, and it's reported by country. But a large part of the GM crops that are grown today are essentially cotton and soybean and corn in the developing world. And it's cotton and soybean which pretty much drives much of the GM crops that are grown. There's some amount of other crops, little bit of mustard, little bit of eggplant, small amount of GM rice, etc. But I don't think the issue has been as much as reluctance of farmers in growing GM crops. And I don't think there's been as much reluctance from consumers in general. I think there's been a bigger reluctance among civil society organizations. And that reluctance on civil society organizations then creates a narrative around consumer fears, etc., of GM crops. That's one area, I think. The other is there's, many of these countries are now becoming food exporting economies. And there is a hesitancy in you having GM food crops, which a country is, when the country is also exporting a food crop. So for example, if a country is exporting rice, then they're hesitant to bring in a GM rice crop because then that affects their overall export market. Just last week, there was a big discussion about the European Union banning India from exporting rice because there was GM rice. Well, it turns out India doesn't have any GM rice. And India has never released a GM rice, but this kind of narrative comes out through civil society organizations, etc., which then makes policymakers in countries like India to become very risk averse on what technologies they can and cannot adopt. It's a whole seminar by itself. But
thank you. We're just about out of time, but I do see a question in the chat box from Joe. Joe, is that something you'd like to unmute and ask?
Well, it was just a follow-up comment, but thank you.
Sure. So I guess that's a no. So I do need to run and go teach. And so I'd like to thank Prabhu for a stimulating talk, very interesting conversation. And we hope to see you here again in Riverside at some point in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See
Bye.
you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.